Bennett's vision blurred as his motorcycle skidded across the slick country road, tires screeching against the pavement. The last thing he saw before impact was a flash of green trees lining the road, then everything went black. When he came to, the smell of rain and earth filled his lungs. Pain shot up his leg and his helmet lay cracked beside him. His Ducati, the sleek machine that had cost more than most people made in a year, was wrecked against a tree. A voice cut through the haze. "Hey, are you alive?" Bennett groaned as footsteps pounded against the wet gravel. A woman crouched beside him, concern etched on her face. Dark curls framed her striking features, her green eyes scanning him with urgency. "You crashed," she said, her voice breathless. "Badly?" "No kidding," Bennett muttered, wincing as he tried to sit up. His ribs protested and pain flared in his leg. "Don't move," she ordered, pushing against his shoulder gently. "You might have broken something." Bennett exhaled sharply. This wasn't how his weekend getaway was supposed to go. He had planned to clear his head, get away from the corporate sharks circling his latest business deal. Instead, he was sprawled out on the side of a deserted road with a stranger tending to him. She pulled out her phone, then cursed under her breath. "No signal, great. Figures," his voice was hoarse. "Where are we?" "About 5 miles from town," she said. "I was driving back from my shift at the diner when I saw the wreck." A waitress. That explained the scent of coffee clinging to her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Willow," she said, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "And you?" "Bennett." He swallowed a groan as he tried to shift again. Willow sighed. "All right, Bennett, you're not walking anywhere like this. My truck's nearby. Let's get you to town." Bennett was not used to being taken care of. In his world, money solved everything. Assistants arranged his appointments. Drivers took him wherever he needed to go, and doctors came to him. But here, in the middle of nowhere, he had no choice but to rely on this woman. She hooked an arm around his waist, bracing herself as he leaned against her. For someone smaller than him, she was surprisingly strong. With every step toward her truck, Bennett's pride took another hit. He was used to control, to power. Yet here he was, limping like a lost man, depending on a waitress who smelled like vanilla and coffee. She helped him into the passenger seat, then jumped behind the wheel. The truck rumbled to life. "You don't seem surprised," Bennett said as she pulled onto the road. "By what?" "That I drive a motorcycle that costs more than this entire town." Willow shot him a glance. "I don't care about that. I care that you're bleeding all over my seat." A laugh escaped him, rough but real. The first genuine one he'd had in weeks. As they drove into town, he realized something strange. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him: money, deals, power. But Willow. She didn't seem to care who he was or what he had. And for the first time in a long time, that intrigued him. Willow pulled into the town's only clinic, the neon open sign flickering in the front window. She shifted the truck into park and turned to Bennett. "Can you walk, or am I carrying you?" Bennett exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "I can manage." She climbed out and rounded the truck just as he opened the door. He shifted his weight to his good leg, gripping the door frame. It was clear he was struggling, but pride kept him silent. Willow didn't offer help this time. She had a feeling he wouldn't accept it. They entered the clinic, the scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. A nurse at the front desk glanced up from her paperwork, her expression shifting to concern. "What happened?" "Motorcycle accident," Willow answered. The nurse grabbed a clipboard. "Dr. Hensley's in the back." "Let's get him to a room." Bennett limped down the hall with Willow at his side, his movements stiff. They entered a small examination room where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A few minutes later, a man in a white coat stepped in, glasses sliding down his nose. "Well, well. You must be the unlucky rider who met our roads the hard way." Bennett sank onto the examining table, his patience thin. You could say that. The doctor checked his ribs, pressed lightly against his leg, and studied the cut on his arm. Nothing broken, but you'll be sore for a while. I'll clean up that wound and wrap your ribs. Try not to do anything reckless for a few weeks. Bennett let out a dry laugh. Not my specialty. Willow crossed her arms. Maybe it should be. He glanced at her, surprised by the edge in her voice. She held his gaze, unyielding. There was something about the way she looked at him, like she wasn't impressed by his usual charm, like she expected better. The doctor patched him up quickly, giving instructions about rest and medication. When they were done, Willow stepped forward. You have somewhere to go, Bennett hesitated. His original plan had been to stay at a luxury cabin on the outskirts of town, but after the accident, he wasn't sure riding back out there was a good idea. Willow studied his silence. Figured as much, come on. Bennett narrowed his eyes. Come on where? My place. It's not much, but it's closer than wherever you were headed, and I don't trust you not to do something stupid. Bennett wasn't used to being taken care of. He was the one who handled things, who made the decisions. But something about Willow's confidence, her complete lack of hesitation, made it impossible to argue. All right, he said, pushing off the table with a wince. She nodded and led the way out. The drive to her house was quiet. Bennett watched the town pass by the small shops, the faded signs, the way people waved at each other like they all belonged to some unspoken understanding. It was a world apart from his own, where every interaction had an angle, a price. When they reached her place, Willow parked in front of a modest house with a porch swing and a garden that looked like it had been tended with care. She got out, grabbed a key from under a flower pot, and unlocked the door. Come on, she said, holding it open. Bennett stepped inside, taking in the cozy interior. It smelled like cinnamon and something floral. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with worn paperbacks. A small kitchen was tucked in the back, its counters clean but cluttered with signs of daily life. She set her keys on a hook. You can take the couch. Bennett raised a brow. Generous, Willow crossed her arms. You want a 5-star hotel, you're in the wrong town. He let out a low chuckle. Believe me, I figured that out already. She grabbed a pillow and a folded blanket from a closet, tossing them onto the couch. I work early, so don't expect breakfast. Bennett lowered himself onto the cushions, stretching out with a sigh. Noted. Willow hesitated, watching him for a moment, then shook her head. Try not to wreck anything else while you're here. With that, she disappeared down the hall, leaving Bennett alone in the quiet house. He stared at the ceiling, the scent of her home surrounding him. It was warm, lived in, different from anything he'd ever known. And for the first time in a long time, he wondered if different wasn't such a bad thing. Bennett woke to the scent of fresh coffee and the distant hum of a radio playing an old country song. The couch wasn't the most comfortable thing he'd ever slept on, but it had done the job. His ribs still ached, but the pain had dulled to something manageable. He shifted, testing his leg. Stiff but functional. He could manage. The sound of footsteps had him turning his head. Willow stood in the small kitchen, her back to him as she poured coffee into a chipped mug. She wore an old sweatshirt, the sleeves pushed up, and her hair was piled into a messy knot on top of her head. She glanced over her shoulder. You're awake. Bennett sat up slowly, pressing a hand to his ribs. Barely. She slid the mug across the counter. Coffee. He pushed to his feet and crossed the room, careful not to favor his leg too much. He wasn't about to let her think he was weaker than he actually was. He took the mug, the warmth seeping into his fingers. You always this hospitable. Willow leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You always this difficult? Bennett huffed a quiet laugh before taking a sip. It was strong, no sugar. The kind of coffee meant to wake you up quick. She studied him for a moment before reaching for her keys on the hook by the door. I've got work. There's food in the fridge if you're hungry. Try not to burn my house down. Bennett lifted a brow. You're leaving me here alone, Willow shrugged. Unless you want to limp around town with me, yeah, he considered it. He wasn't used to being idle, to waiting, and yet something about this town about her made him stay put. She grabbed her coat and was out the door before he could say anything else. Left alone, Bennett wandered through her small space, taking it in. The bookshelf caught his attention. He ran a finger along the spines, recognizing some of the titles. The collection was varied classics, mysteries, a few worn romance novels. He wasn't sure why that surprised him. His gaze drifted to a small corkboard near the door. Tacked onto it were a few photos, one of Willow standing in front of the diner, another of her with an older woman, both of them laughing. Notes were scribbled on scraps of paper, reminders about groceries and car repairs. It was a life, lived simply but fully. Bennett exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He had never been the kind of man to linger in places like this. And yet, something about Willow's world felt grounding. The hours passed slowly. He found himself restless, pacing. He wasn't used to staying put in one place without a purpose. By midday, he decided he needed air. The walk to town was slow, his leg reminding him he wasn't fully healed, but he ignored it. The diner wasn't hard to find. It was one of the only buildings that looked busy, with locals filtering in and out. Through the window, he spotted Willow moving between tables, balancing a tray effortlessly. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling. Willow spotted him immediately, her brows lifting. "You're supposed to be resting." Bennett eased onto a stool at the counter. "I was bored," she sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're impossible." The older woman from the photo on her corkboard appeared behind the counter, setting down a fresh pot of coffee. She glanced at Bennett, then at Willow. "This him?" she asked. Willow huffed. "Yeah, this is him." The woman appraised him, then nodded, "Thought he'd be worse." Bennett let out a quiet laugh. "I'm right here, you know." The woman poured him a fresh cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one. "So what's your deal? Just passing through?" Bennett met Willow's gaze before answering. "Something like that." Willow rolled her eyes and moved to tend to another table. The woman leaned on the counter, giving him a knowing look. "She's got a good heart." "Don't mess with her." Bennett's grip tightened around the mug. "I wouldn't." The woman studied him for a moment longer before nodding, seemingly satisfied. Willow returned a few minutes later, setting a plate of food in front of him without asking if he wanted it. "You look like you could use a real meal," she said. Bennett glanced at the plate: eggs, toast, bacon, simple, but it smelled good. He picked up a fork, testing the eggs. "Not bad," Willow smirked. "High praise." Bennett took another bite. The diner buzzed around them, filled with easy conversation and the clatter of dishes. It was different from the restaurants he usually frequented. No fancy menus, no overpriced meals, but it felt real. He glanced at Willow as she moved around the diner, talking to customers like she actually knew them, like this place mattered to her. And for the first time in a long time, Bennett found himself wondering what it would be like to belong somewhere like this. Bennett didn't leave town. Days blurred into a rhythm he hadn't expected. Mornings spent on Willow's porch, nursing coffee as the sun climbed over the quiet streets. Afternoons at the diner, where he found himself lingering longer than necessary just to watch her move from table to table, her laughter slipping into the air like something that belonged there. The wound on his arm healed, his ribs ached less, but something else had taken root inside him, something that had nothing to do with the accident. He was falling for her, and it terrified him. One evening, after the diner had closed and the town had settled into its usual peaceful hush, Bennett found himself sitting on Willow's porch steps, watching the fireflies flicker in the distance. She stepped outside barefoot, her arms crossed as she leaned against the railing. "You're still here." Her voice was quieter than usual. Bennett exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Guess I am." She sat beside him, the air still warm from the lingering heat of the day. Most people who pass through don't stay long. He turned his head, looking at her in the dim glow of the porch light. I'm not most people. Willow's lips pressed together as if she didn't quite believe him, but she didn't argue. Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Bennett wasn't a man who second-guessed himself. He made decisions, lived with them, never looked back. But this was different. He had built his life on control, on calculated risks, on knowing the outcome before he even made a move. But with Willow, there was no strategy, no guarantee, just her. Just this moment. And it was enough. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing over hers before he laced them together. She didn't pull away. I don't do this, he admitted, his voice rougher than he intended. Willow's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. Do what? Stay. She was quiet for a long moment, then squeezed his hand gently. Maybe it's time you did. The words settled into his chest, heavier than they should have been, because deep down he already knew he wasn't leaving, not this time, not without her. Bennett had never been one to hesitate. His life had been built on sharp decisions, risks calculated to the finest detail. But sitting beside Willow on her porch, fireflies flickering in the dark, he found himself on unfamiliar ground. He wanted to stay. But wanting something and knowing how to hold on to it were two different things. The town had settled into silence, the hum of crickets filling the spaces between them. Willow's fingers were still laced with his, warm and steady. She didn't rush him, didn't demand answers. That was the thing about her, she let the world come to her instead of chasing it. Bennett had spent his entire life chasing. The thought unsettled him. A breeze drifted through the night, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. Willow tilted her head, studying him like she could see past the walls he had spent years perfecting. You don't talk much about where you're from, she said. Bennett exhaled, staring out at the darkened town. Not much to say. Willow arched an eyebrow. I doubt that, he hesitated. No one ever asked him about himself without an angle. They wanted access, power, a piece of what he had built. But Willow, she didn't want anything, and that made him want to tell her everything. My family built an empire, he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. I was expected to take over, make it bigger, stronger. More profitable? Willow didn't look impressed, which was another thing about her that disarmed him. Most people would have leaned in, eager for details, curious about the world he came from. But she only nodded, waiting. I did what was expected, he continued. Built my own fortune, expanded our reach, it worked. I got everything I was supposed to want. Her gaze didn't waver. But, Bennett's fingers tightened around hers, but I woke up one day and realized I didn't even know what I was chasing anymore. Willow let that settle between them before she spoke again. So you got on your motorcycle and ran. He huffed a quiet laugh. Something like that. She didn't judge him for it, didn't tell him he was ungrateful or reckless. She just nodded like she understood, and maybe she did. The thought made something shift inside him, something he wasn't sure he could name. She glanced at their joined hands. So what happens now? Bennett's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of the question, of what she wasn't saying. She wasn't the kind of woman who would wait forever. If he wanted this, if he wanted her, he had to decide. He took a slow breath, then lifted her hand, pressing his lips against her knuckles. It was an answer, even if he didn't have the words yet. Willow searched his face, something unreadable passing through her expression. Then she smiled, not the polite kind, not the small ones she gave customers at the diner, but something real. Bennett felt it like a punch to the ribs. He was in trouble, and for the first time in his life, he didn't want to run from it. The next morning, Bennett found himself at the diner again, but this time he wasn't just killing time. He had a plan. Willow was behind the counter, wiping down the surface as the morning rush settled into a comfortable lull. She looked up as he approached. something flickering in her expression, surprise, maybe. Anticipation. Bennett leaned against the counter, holding her gaze. I want to stay. Willow's fingers stilled against the rag. For how long? Long enough to figure out what's next. She studied him, searching for cracks in his resolve. And what if what's next isn't here? Bennett's jaw tightened. Then I'll make it here. Willow's breath hitched, just slightly. Then she set the rag down, her hands resting flat against the counter. You're serious. I don't say things I don't mean. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak right away. Bennett reached into his pocket, pulling out a set of keys. He placed them on the counter between them. I bought the old mechanic shop down the road, he said. Figured the guy retiring needed someone to take it over. Willow blinked. You bought the garage, he shrugged, trying to play it off, but the truth was, he had made the decision the second he realized he wasn't willing to leave her behind. I know how to fix things, he said. Might as well put it to use. Willow stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile curved her lips. You really aren't leaving? No, Bennett said, reaching for her hand across the counter. I'm not. And for the first time in his life, staying felt like the biggest risk he had ever taken. But for her, it was one he was willing to take. The garage smelled like motor oil and fresh paint, the scent of something new mixing with the remnants of what had been there before. Bennett stood in the middle of the shop, surveying the space that now belonged to him. Tools lined the walls, the workbenches worn but sturdy. The old owner had left behind more than just equipment. There were faded calendars pinned to the walls, a radio with a missing dial, and a stack of invoices from decades past. He had spent his life in boardrooms, closing deals worth millions, but this was different. This wasn't about money or power. It was about building something real, something that didn't require ruthless negotiations or corporate takeovers. And it was about Willow. She walked in, her presence as effortless as the morning breeze that slipped through the open garage doors. She had a to-go cup in one hand, a small paper bag in the other. She set them both on the workbench beside him, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. You look like a man trying to figure out what he just got himself into, she said. Bennett exhaled, running a hand through his hair. That obvious. She handed him the coffee, only to me. Her voice held something warm, something knowing. She had a way of seeing through him, past the layers of control and calculation, peeling him back to the man underneath. He took a sip, the coffee strong and exactly how he liked it. I've never done anything like this before, he admitted. Willow leaned against the workbench, crossing her arms. Starting over. Staying, he corrected, his gaze locked on hers. Her breath caught for just a second, almost imperceptible. But he noticed. He always noticed when it came to her. She reached into the paper bag and pulled out a folded napkin, handing it to him. Then you better eat. Can't build a life on an empty stomach. Bennett chuckled, unfolding the napkin to reveal a breakfast sandwich. Simple, thoughtful, just like everything she did. As he took a bite, she wandered toward the shelves, trailing a finger along a row of neatly arranged wrenches. Did you always like fixing things? He swallowed, considering the question. I liked taking things apart when I was a kid, figuring out how they worked. My father hated it, thought it was a waste of time. Willow turned, leaning her hip against the counter. And now, Bennett looked around the garage at the tools, at the possibilities. Now I think it makes more sense than anything else I've done. A slow smile touched her lips. Good. That one word settled something inside him, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. The days that followed were filled with work, real work, the kind that left grease on his hands and sweat on his skin. He learned the ins and outs of the garage, took on jobs from locals who looked at him like he was an oddity, a man who didn't quite belong here but was trying anyway. Willow was never far. She brought him lunch when she had a break from the diner, sat on the edge of his workbench in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. One night, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the town had grown quiet, she lingered in the garage, watching as he wiped down a set of tools. "You're different," she said softly. Bennett paused, glancing at her. "Different how?" She took a slow breath, as if choosing her words carefully. "Less like a man who's ready to run." He set the tool down, wiping his hands on a rag before stepping closer. "That's because I'm not running anymore." Willow met his gaze, something flickering in her eyes, hope maybe, or something deeper. He reached out, tucking a curl behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her skin. "I meant what I said. I'm staying." She searched his face as if trying to find any cracks in his resolve. But there were none. Then, finally, she closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that tasted like certainty. Bennett wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer, deepening the kiss with the kind of promise that didn't need words. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "Good," she whispered. And just like that, everything he had been searching for, everything he hadn't even realized he needed, was right there in his arms. 1 year later, the garage had become more than just a place to work. It had become part of the town. Part of him. The once wary locals now greeted him by name, bringing their cars in with trust instead of skepticism. And Willow, she was still the heart of it all. She stood outside the diner, wiping her hands on her apron as Bennett pulled up in his truck. He hopped out, a small velvet box tucked in his pocket, his pulse steady with the kind of certainty he had never known before her. Willow arched an eyebrow as he approached. "You're early," Bennett smirked. "Couldn't wait." She tilted her head, studying him. "For what?" He took her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles before dropping to one knee. Willow's breath hitched, her eyes widening. Bennett flipped open the box, revealing the ring, a simple, elegant band with a single diamond that caught the evening light. "I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I don't want a life without you in it. So marry me." Willow stared at him, her lips parting, her eyes shining with something he had only ever dreamed of seeing. Then, with a breathless laugh, she nodded. "Yes." Bennett slid the ring onto her finger, then stood, pulling her into his arms, kissing her like a man who had found exactly where he was meant to be. And this time, he wasn't going anywhere. Not without her,